On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, shockwaves over the greatest media failure in modern political history. Failing to grasp, with all the talk about Hillary Clinton on the verge of victory, that the country would elect President Trump.
So we are having a conversation now that it was impossible to have 2 weeks ago. It was just improbable. You were not having a reality-based conversation trying to do this map.
It's just remarkable because, I mean, I don't think we can overstate this. Not only Democrats and the Clinton campaign, not only pollsters and the mainstream media, but Republicans did not anticipate that this night was going to be this way.
I think we're all, at least I'm coming to the conclusion, and conclusion is the wrong word, to open to the possibility Donald Trump could be the next president of the United States. Let's be honest, there's no one I know who thought this 3 hours ago.
To those who have chosen not to support me in the past, of which there were a few people, I'm reaching out to you for your guidance and your help so that we can work together and unify our great country.
Why did so many journalists underestimate the anger and frustration of Trump's voters? Why were the pundits and the pollsters so spectacularly wrong? And why are some liberal commentators blaming the press for not stopping Trump? That's not our job. Plus, Donald Trump says Twitter helped him win the election. And can journalists now be fair to the president-elect? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. The New York Times published a truly extraordinary banner headline after the election. Here it is. Democrats, students, and foreign allies face the reality of a Trump presidency. The clear implication was that many people the paper finds sympathetic remain shocked, even appalled, by the prospect of President Trump. It's virtually impossible to imagine such a Times headline after a Democratic victory. The paper's editor and publisher now saying perhaps Trump's sheer unconventionality led them to underestimate his support and promising to be fair. This is some journalists and even some media critics question how the news business so utterly botched this high-stakes election that so many expected Hillary Clinton to win.
It's hard to be a parent tonight for a lot of us. You tell your kids, don't be a bully. You tell your kids, don't be a bigot. They're afraid of, how do I explain this to my children?
Laura Ingraham, according to a report in The Hill, under consideration for White House press secretary. Joining us now to analyze the coverage of the election and its aftermath, Erin McPike, a political commentator and former reporter for Real Clear Politics. Kristen Soltis Anderson, a Washington Examiner columnist and a Republican strategist. And Julie Roginski, a Democratic strategist and Fox News contributor. Erin, the election is over, and it seems to me that there are still major elements in the media that are kind of being hostile to President-elect Trump. What explains that?
I don't know what explains it, but there's still obviously a lot of shock. You showed the New York Times headline from Thursday morning, but we continue to see headlines in the New York Times that are of resignation. I would point you to the Washington Post, where the headlines are more of intrigue and an openness to cover what is to come. But we even saw that Arthur Sulzberger Jr. put out this memo to readers on Friday saying we got it wrong, as you mentioned. They're still trying to figure it out, but they haven't quite gotten there yet. We are seeing today, I looked through the pages of the New York Times, not just the front page, and they are doing stories now on what is actually going on in the Rust Belt. Where were those stories after he won the primary?
Well,
where was the Mood of the Country
the
story?
media consensus was the Rust Belt wasn't in play. Hillary Clinton had it locked up. Here's a story in the New York Times. It's a news story, Kristen, from when he met with President Obama at the White House. Mr. Trump, whose campaign drew support from white supremacist groups, sat in front of a bust of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So are the media risking their credibility with these kinds of news passages and headlines?
There are a lot of places, when you look at the election returns, that voted for Obama quite heavily 2 elections in a row. Places like Luzerne County in Pennsylvania that have now flipped and become Trump country. These are not places that have been rejecting President Obama all along. These are places that, for economic reasons, have changed their attitude and decided that Trump is the person who's most likely to...
Right, so why did the press not pick up on that during 18 months of campaigning?
I think, you saw in a lot of polls that you always had the white working class leaning towards Trump. What was missed was that a lot of, for instance, college-educated white voters, etc., were breaking for Donald Trump. Black voters, Latino voters, the exit polls suggest, broke for Donald Trump in much higher margins than the polls would have suggested. So I think that's actually the group that the media missed. It wasn't the white working class so much, because we knew that they were going to go for Trump. It's a lot of white college-educated professionals, African Americans and Latinos, who voted for Trump even though the media said that would be impossible.
Julie, it seems like some of the media just can't come to grips right now with the fact that Trump won. What do you think of that? And why don't you start with your own reaction when you came out of the train station here in Washington?
I did. I came here yesterday. I walked out of Union Station. I looked at the Capitol where I used to work, and I said, I just can't believe it. And I think a lot of people, not just in the media, but Democrats like me and others, are in disbelief. I will say, and having thought about this, I think the conclusion that I came to is people like me, and I'll put the blame on myself as well as the media, live in an ivory tower. We live in Washington or we live in New York. We aren't worried necessarily about putting our kids through college. We can afford to do that. We're not worried so much about paying for our health care. We can do that. We're not worried so much about making our mortgage or our rent payments. We can do that. What we have forgotten, to our own detriment, is that there are people who, whenever I went on TV over the last 4 years and said, but wait, the economy's getting better, look at these metrics, there are white working class voters, and not just white working class voters, but as you pointed out, Latinos and African Americans and others, who said, maybe on paper it's getting better, but I can't pay my mortgage.
Right.
You're saying it's great that more people that have health care insurance thanks to Obamacare, which I've consistently touted, but I'm paying more and more out of my pocket for those premiums. And people like me forgot about those people.
There's a phrase of that. Yeah. It's called out of touch. And Erin, let me play for you a question that I asked you just this past Sunday, 2 days before the election. Erin, a number of pundits came out 2 weeks ago, said this race was over, done, Hillary was going to win, who's going to be in her cabinet, no way Trump could pull this thing off. Was that, in retrospect, reckless? And you basically said that it was, and this is when no one thought Trump was going to win. So if virtually all the media were wrong about Hillary Clinton winning this election, what does it say? I mean, Political had a headline that the morning of the election, Trump needs a miracle. How do we now have the pundits coming on saying, well, we're going to tell you what's going to happen in this thing that we said was not going to happen?
What do you mean? That the pundits are going to say what's going to happen in a Trump presidency?
Yeah.
We all just need to cover what's going to happen over the next 70 days. Actually cover what Trump is going to do. Start asking him those questions. Going back to some of your points, I think there was a laziness in leaning on polls versus actually covering what's going on in the country. You know, you and I, Howard, have talked for a long time about how many news organizations are shutting down bureaus and not getting out in the country. This is a moment for news organizations to go back and to reopen their Chicago bureaus and staff them up and actually go out into the country and report on what it is people are talking about and what they want.
How about a bureau in Detroit? You know, and the journalists who tried to say, well, Donald Trump has a bigger path than people realize. We played a clip last week of Brian Williams on MSNBC sort of lecturing Mark Halperin, who wasn't saying Trump was going to win, but was going to say, here's how he could get to 270. You're being too optimistic. Well, it turns out Halperin was right. So even when the data were there was a sort of a groupthink about it, where it was not.
Well, there were some states where it was a groupthink problem. So, for instance, in the state of Pennsylvania, the polls only showed Clinton with a slim lead in Pennsylvania, but this narrative was, well, Pennsylvania is always loosey with the football, right? Republicans always think they can win Pennsylvania, but they can't. So there, it was people misreading the data. But there were other states. I mean, Wisconsin, the polls were off by over 6 points. You had a state like Michigan, the polls were off by 3 points. You had Ohio, the polls off by 5 points. The polling errors were not uniform across the country. Polls got some states like New Hampshire, Virginia, perfect. But it was just the right combination of states that led people to think there were pieces that were completely off the board, especially in the upper Midwest.
Upper Midwest, right.
And if you actually consider those states in play, then suddenly your 80% projection for Clinton has to become much more even.
A lot of changes now in the media. For example, Corey Lewandowski, Trump's first campaign manager, resigning from CNN, where he'd been a commentator, is likely to go into the Trump administration. Let me put up on the screen for you the cover of People magazine. It's kind of a standard post-election coverage. You see it there, President Trump. Now inside there's a photo spread dealing with Ivanka Trump and so forth. The magazine took so much heat over this, including from some Hollywood celebrities who said, we're never going to give interviews, we're going to boycott. But the editor had to put out a statement saying, this isn't a celebration, it's a news story.
Well, he's right, it is a news story. What I find interesting about People magazine is they had their own reporters saying that Donald Trump had assaulted her. And
yes, former People writers said this happened a decade ago. This doesn't change that allegation.
It doesn't change that at all. But I find interesting is that the same editors who came to her defense are now putting this out. I think there's a little incongruity here. And what I find interesting to some extent is there has been from the media, not with People magazine specifically, but there has been a way of covering, for example, Hillary Clinton that now I hope the same kind of attention turns to Donald Trump. For example, the conflict between the Trump organization and their finances and what President Trump will do. Something like that is very important for the media to focus on. And I feel like...
What are these outlets supposed to do? Just like pretend he didn't win the election, not have a headline about President Trump?
No, they should cover it, but they should cover it as vociferously as
This is
covered
about
by
a cover.
Here's the thing about People magazine. When you're a reporter, you very much want your editors to have your back, and you want them to stick up for you when you've written a story and someone says that's not true. But you can't ever believe that in any dust-up that you get into, or any serious event as she did, that they're going to upend their entire editorial mission. Most magazines around this country are going to put the president-elect on the cover.
Yeah.
That's just a fact.
Our business.
But you can't have them change their editorial.
Let me get to, everyone knows there's been anti-Trump protests in major cities around the country. And Trump riled some people up by tweeting that this was being incited by the media. I don't know if that's true. But this question of his use of Twitter, he's got 15 million followers, came up in an interview that will air tonight on CBS's 60 Minutes. Leslie Stahl asked him whether, as president, he would continue to be quite so vociferous on Twitter. Take a look. Importance of Twitter, and do you believe President Trump will be very restrained?
Donald Trump has uncovered that people are interested in getting their information straight from a source, straight from a candidate, rather than through the filter of perhaps the media. And I think, a lot of the folks that are going to criticize him, and I may well be one of them for not being traditionally presidential, I think what we need to realize is that for a lot of people, traditionally presidential, being very restrained on something like Twitter, is not necessarily what they voted for, that the concept of what is presidential may well be changing.
And Julie, this didn't last that long, because this morning, the real Donald Trump, at real Donald Trump, tweets, wow, New York Times is losing thousands of subscribers because of their poor and highly inaccurate coverage of the Trump phenomenon. So he's back to whacking the media.
Yeah, schadenfreude is what we all need from our president. Look, I think he has to understand that when the president speaks, markets are moved, foreign policy decisions get made. These are not things that should be done in a vacuum based on 140-character tweets that the president tweets out. You have to give a little thought, and not in the middle of the night, about tweeting out something that you're upset about.
When the president speaks or tweets.
Right.
All right, let me get a break. Let us know what you think. Stick to the media. MediaBuzz at foxnews.com. When we come back, Hillary Clinton's campaign chief says one of the reasons she lost was the press was against her. And later, Sharyl Attkisson on media bias, the election outcome, and the coming coverage of the Trump administration. By the way, is New York Magazine going to retract this loser cover? Can you retract a cover? Turns out Hillary Clinton's campaign is also charging media bias now that she's lost the election everyone expected her to win. Kristen, in a conference call with donors yesterday, widely reported by the media, Hillary Clinton talked about FBI Chief James Comey renewing that investigation. Into the email, our analysis is that Comey's letter raising doubts that were groundless, baseless, proven to be, stopped our momentum, says Hillary Clinton. Now, we'll never know what would have happened had this not happened. Could it be said that the saturation coverage of Comey's renewed investigation did change the atmosphere of the...
He was already falling in the polls before the Comey letter. And frankly, I mean, if you ask about anything in these last 2 weeks that would have changed a voter's mind, I think something like the Affordable Care Act premiums announcement is going to have much more of an effect on someone's pocketbook than a rehashing of the debate over the emails that we'd already been having for months. So I think the idea that that stopped her momentum, I have a lot of questions about that.
Fair enough. I think it stopped her media momentum because that was the story for days. Now, Julie, John Podesta, the former campaign chairman for Clinton, said, according to The Hill on a different conference call, the media always covered her as the person who would be president and therefore tried to eviscerate her before the election, but covered Trump as someone who was entertaining and sort of gave him a pass. Gave him a pass? What do you think?
Well, I think, and this is due to Trump, not necessarily the media, started to normalize some of his more, in my mind, reprehensible comments, whether about Judge Curiel or about women or anything else.
What do you mean when you're saying the media normalized?
Because when you have, let's remember Mitt Romney had that binder full of women comment, and then the 48% or 47%, everybody went ballistic. It was one misstep, right? Trump had so many time and time again that it almost became normalized. It almost didn't become anything, not one became crazy and something that was anathema to people because so many of them happened that people were starting to get used to it. I will say, look, I think at the end of the day, people voted for hope and change in 2008. Those same people voted for hope and change now. People were promised in the height of the Great Recession that their pocketbooks were going to be fuller, that they were not going to be paying as much for health care, as you pointed out. And it didn't happen. And you can't say that people who voted for Trump are all racist or bigots or anything else. A lot of them were Obama voters twice over. They voted for the same thing.
You can't say that, even though some people have been saying that, and we'll talk about that later in the program. Also interesting that now Donald Trump is saying he may preserve some elements of Obamacare, particularly ban on pre-existing conditions and allowing young people under 26 to stay on the parents' policies, which some people could say, oh, he's changing his mind. All presidents-elect go through this. They have to reconcile their campaign promises with reality. But in that Podesta conversation, he said that he was talking about what they view as the over-coverage of the email scandal versus Donald Trump's business conflicts, didn't release his tax returns. But does the Clinton camp really believe the media were not aggressive enough toward Donald Trump?
They may. I think that the bigger problem that the Clinton campaign has is how they were covered, because so many people would just say in a blanket fashion that the media may be anti-Trump, but they certainly weren't in the tank for Hillary Clinton. And the reason that I would point to on that is that over the course of this campaign, the media was on this activist mission to get Hillary Clinton to apologize for everything, whether it was her emails, whether it was Benghazi, whether it was her husband's transgressions in the past. It was all this activist mission, and it was very strange rather than covering what she would actually do, and I think that's why Podesta was...
Her own top advisor said she had a pathological inability to apologize, but at the same time, some of these WikiLeaks disclosures, whether it was Donna Brazile leaking CNN's questions in advance, other journalists cozying up to the Clinton campaign, made a lot of people think that the press was, if not in the tank for Hillary Clinton, certainly very sympathetic to her.
Well, if you take a look, Gallup has been asking this question over the last number of decades. Do you think that the presidential candidates are talking about issues that matter to you? Is that what you hear when you tune into the media and you see what's being discussed? And we hit record lows in this campaign. And I place a lot of blame on, for instance, the Clinton campaign for that.
But do you place some blame on the media, which was constantly distracted by, Access Hollywood, all kinds of accusations?
I would love to have seen more coverage of the issues. But you know what? People knew that Donald Trump wanted to build a wall, renegotiate trade deals. He made very clear what he wanted to do. Hillary Clinton had a basket of about 5,000 things that she would talk about variously, and I think that makes it hard for any one message to break through that clutter.
All right, we are going to leave it there. Julie Roginski, Kristen Soltis-Anderson, and Aaron McPike, thanks very much for stopping by this Sunday Ahead. Frank Luntz has some brand new polling on how Americans view the coverage of this election. But first, some ugly stuff for liberal commentators, I mentioned this earlier, who are still railing against Donald Trump, his voters, and the press. I understand that liberal commentators are upset that Donald Trump has just won the White House. What I don't understand is why they are still saying ugly things in the wake of the election. Jamel Bowie is Slate's chief political correspondent and an African-American who wrote last May, Donald Trump isn't going to be president. Bowie tweeted after the election results, I didn't quite understand how much white people hated us. What? Many white voters helped give Barack Obama 2 terms. CNN commentator Van Jones, a former Obama White House aide, said this.
We haven't talked about race. This was a white lash. This was a white lash against a changing country. It was a white lash against a black president in part.
A white lash because your candidate lost? It's fine to be critical of Trump, but he did spend time reaching out to the black community. And then there's a guy I respect, media critic Jeff Jarvis, who heads a graduate journalism program at the City University of New York. He said journalism seemed broken, tweeting, quote, my profession failed to inform the public about the fascists they are electing. Did you miss how much negative stuff the press dumped on Trump? Jarvis also called the outcome, again quoting, the victory of the uneducated and uninformed. Sorry, it's really unattractive when you call voters dumb because you don't agree with their decision. Neil Gabler, a prominent author, really went off. America died on November 8th, 2016, not with a bang or a whimper, but at its own hand via electoral suicide. We will brace for the violence, the anger, the racism, the misogyny, the xenophobia, the nativism, the white sense of grievance that will undoubtedly be unleashed now. Pretty scary stuff. And what about director Aaron Sorkin? His heroes are usually preachy liberals like Martin Sheen on The West Wing, a program I really liked. In a letter to his daughter and wife posted by Vanity Fair, Sorkin wrote, this is truly horrible. It is the first time that a thoroughly incompetent pig with dangerous ideas, a serious psychiatric disorder, no knowledge of the world, and no curiosity to learn has won. And it wasn't just Donald Trump who won last night. It was his supporters, too. The Klan won last night. White nationalists, sexists, racists, and buffoons. The Klan won? That might have played in a TV drama, but as a letter, it just seemed angry and overwrought. Aren't liberals supposed to support tolerance and unity? Wouldn't they have been furious if Hillary had won and conservatives kept trashing her? You can still fight for your beliefs, but perhaps you should follow President Obama's lead and be a bit more gracious toward the guy who won. Coming up, one of the leading never-Trumpers, Rich Lowry, and a former Democratic spokesman face off over the coverage of this election. And later, Sharyl Attkisson on some stunning negative headlines greeting President-elect Trump. The election may be over, but some in the media are still furious, perhaps a bit shell-shocked at the outcome. That includes conservative commentators who were in the never-Trump camp and liberal commentators who were in the I can't even imagine this guy as president camp. Joining us now in New York, Rich Lowry, editor of National Review and a Fox News contributor. And here in Washington, Mo Alithi, executive director of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics, a one-time Democratic spokesman, and now also a brand new Fox News contributor. Welcome, gentlemen. Rich, you famously put out an issue of National Review against Trump, and you've been pretty steadfast in opposing him. Do you now have mixed feelings about Donald Trump becoming president?
Well, the against Trump issue was in the primaries, and in the general election, we never got on board the Trump train, but our coverage of Hillary Clinton was much harsher. Every cover we ran about the presidential race in the general election was an anti-Hillary cover. I'm not sure any news organization out there had more harsh coverage and incisive coverage of the email controversy and the Comey investigation than we did. But yeah, I was surprised as anyone. I always wrote he could win this thing. I could see him getting to 260 electoral votes, but I had a lot of trouble seeing him getting over the top. He did it. My hat's off to him. And now we're hoping for the best. You had a lot of company in that regard. Now, Trump, Rich, not only ran against the mainstream press, but he ran against you and National Review and the Weekly Standard and Bill Kristol and Krauthammer and Jonah. Does his victory undercut you a bit in terms of who now defines conservatism within the Republican Party? Yeah, well, so in the party now, we have this enormous populist wing that most people wouldn't have thought there was any chance that even existed a year ago. And the populists control the presidency within the party. The conservatives control Congress. And if everyone can keep it together, there's a chance to do a lot of good. But the populists clearly have the whip hand because you always want to control the White House. And if you look how just through the course of National Review's history, it's been more common that we've had uncomfortable and awkward relationships with Republican presidents rather than hand-in-glove relationships. Really the only exception would be Ronald Reagan, and we had problems with him at times. But when Trump is right and he's getting hit on all sides, we'll be among his fiercest defenders. When he's wrong, we'll have the independents to call him out and try to correct him.
All right. Mo, did liberal commentators like yourself underestimate Donald Trump and perhaps overestimate the appeal of Hillary Clinton?
Look, I think I also have been eating a lot of crow. I thought, back in the spring during the primaries when we saw what was going on, I thought a lot of Democrats were underestimating his potential. I thought there was a path for him that he could win. But like Rich just said, and like a lot of other people, didn't think it was very likely. I think one of the problems that too many of us had was that we were too busy looking at this election through an old paradigm, looking at it through a paradigm of left versus right, looking at it through the paradigm of the two candidates, and didn't spend enough time looking at what was happening around the country and this populist wave that swept the country.
And I would say that the media, by and large, were guilty of that as well.
That's right.
Especially looking back. Now, but so when CNN's Van Jones says the election was a white lash against a black president, when Slate's Jamel Bouie says, I didn't realize how much white people hate us, is that adding to the divisiveness in the country?
Look, I believe that, again, and I was wrong before, but I believe that there was this incredibly strong, unheard voice in middle America that saw Donald Trump as the vehicle to be heard. It turns out that much of that voice was blue collar, was white. Now, what we need to be careful about is pitting that voice against the Democratic coalition, against African Americans and Hispanics. And where I think the left and Democrats are going to have to go moving forward is figuring out how to bridge these two different constituencies once again, as opposed to just taking one side against another.
Let me get Rich back in. When terms like white lash are thrown around, Barack Obama, remember, was not on the ballot this time. Do you think some in the media are going too far in defining this election in strictly and even harshly racial terms?
Of course, and it's what always happens. It's very boring, and it's completely wrong. As was pointed out earlier in the program, one of the key swing votes in this election was working class voters who had voted for Obama in 2012 and went for Trump this time. They didn't all of a sudden become hideous racists in the course of 4 years. And I think it's very important for folks on the left to try to extend a little more sympathetic understanding to these working class whites rather than having contempt for them. And Mo's exactly right. You know, you can appeal to both sides. And there used to be Democratic politicians who really tried to do that, like Bill Clinton. It's just this time around, both the Democratic Party and the media just seem to think there was something wrong inherently in even trying to have appeal to these voters.
And Mo, I'm hearing some commentators on your side now talk about sexism, that Hillary Clinton couldn't get there, as opposed to all the other reasons we've talked about. She didn't visit Michigan until the very end, the emails, everything else, that she couldn't get there because she's a woman. Does that seem oversimplified?
I think it's probably a bit oversimplified. I'm not saying that there isn't inherent sexism in many ways, but I don't think that's what defined this election. What I will say, though, is whether we're talking about racism or sexism, I believe that we've got to try to bridge the gap, and we shouldn't overplay that. But having said that, it is important to realize that the rhetoric that Donald Trump used throughout the election did scare and alienate millions of Americans in a lot of these groups. And so there is still that voice that needs to be heard. I hope the president-elect, just as Democrats, I think, need to reach out and try to be heard by these white, blue-collar voters. Right. He has to begin to do his part to mend that divide with the people who are scared.
Rich, I've got half a minute. I mean, Donald Trump ran against the press of all stripes, middle, left, and center. Do you think that was a factor in his victory?
It was. Republicans always complain about the press, and oftentimes it just comes off as whiny. I think it had more impact this time because the bias was more obvious, one. And two, it fit into this generalized theme that Trump had that was very powerful, that the system's rigged and our institutions are failing us. And the press is still, incredibly biased. If Trump supporters were out in the thousands after Hillary Clinton's Hillary Clinton victory and breaking things and smashing windows and throwing things at cops, it would be front page news. There would be a tsunami of criticism throughout the media, and we're hearing none of that about these anti-Trump protesters.
I can't disagree with that. And on that point, Rich Lowry, Mo Alithi, thanks very much for joining us. Ahead on Media Buzz, why are the mainstream media just now owning up to the biased and misleading coverage that marred much of this campaign? Sharyl Attkisson on why it was obvious all along. And later, the late-night comics choking on Donald Trump's victory. The election may be over, but some of the media remain really angry about the billionaire Republican who just won the White House. New York's Daily News, which ridiculed Donald Trump as a clown and a dummy throughout the campaign, House of Horrors, you see the White House. Salon, the misogyny apocalypse. The New Yorker magazine, An American Tragedy, editor David Remnick saying Donald Trump's victory is a triumph for the forces of nativism, authoritarianism, misogyny, and racism. Joining us now, an old friend of the show, Sharyl Attkisson, the host of Full Measure, which airs Sunday mornings on Sinclair television stations, and author of the upcoming book, The Smear. So for a year and a half, you were among the few voices that were saying, don't underestimate Donald Trump, don't write him off, don't minimize his appeal. Now you have lots of journalists coming out saying, boy, we got it wrong, we blew it.
I think part of that is because I'm not a political insider. I wasn't looking at the polls for my results and predictions. I was listening to ordinary people, listening to anecdotes, traveling the country and asking my friends, liberals, conservatives, and those who are in between. And it was pretty clear to me, as I predicted, that Trump would win or would likely win.
Yeah. Well, do you think there's kind of a groupthink that sets in a situation like this where everyone the journalists know is against Trump, everyone on their Twitter feed is mocking Trump, perhaps in many cases reinforced by their own personal biases that this guy who never held political office was not fit for the White House?
Absolutely. You put your finger on it. And I think that in the big picture, to me, the media has allowed itself, we've allowed ourselves to be infiltrated by political operatives, meaning we hire them, we welcome them into our newsroom, they work, ideological people work in the news department, they shape coverage, they work as managers, and that's one reason why I think you had a whole rash of news outlets actually trying to overtly, and admit they were doing this, convince people who to vote for rather than just bring the facts and report on the campaign.
But don't you think that viewers on all the networks who see these political commentators, many of them, 2 days removed from the previous campaign on the right or the left, know that these are partisans and don't view them, or do they now view them as kind of like we're all a bunch of insiders, whether you grew up in journalism or you grew up in politics?
I think they see everybody as sort of the insiders. There is a market for that. I mean, clearly some people want to hear that sort of coverage as was given in the campaign. But someone tweeted to me, there are more of us who think for ourselves than there are of you trying to tell us what to think. And I think that kind of sums it up.
Cheryl, I watched in amazement as editors, journalists, even the New York Times media columnists said that Trump is such a different, such a dangerous character in their view, or potentially dangerous, that we have to suspend our usual standards and cover him differently and more aggressively than Hillary Clinton, who's, you know, a career politician, former cabinet member. And then you see this USA Today poll by nearly 10-1. People said the media wanted Hillary Clinton to win, and that included 3/4 of Clinton supporters. So people are getting it.
Yeah, and because they admitted it, I think there's always been a subtext or belief that the media is in on it sometimes, but they really came out, USA Today, for the first time in a 34-year history, saying that they were going to weigh in on a presidential campaign, don't vote for Trump. The New York Times behavior, which I think was particularly remarkable, according to my information, they had a lot of information about stories they could have done on Hillary Clinton that in a neutral sense a news organization would have done, and yet they made the decision to hold or withhold those stories. Things like that have really cut into what credibility we in the media have.
And speaking of that, I mean, given this embarrassing performance, and there's really no other word for it, do you think the press will learn some lessons for the future, particularly when it comes to sort of getting out of the New York, Washington bubble?
Not really. I think that
You're not optimistic.
No. The same people who made these decisions, which I think in many instances were particularly bad and egregious decisions from a journalistic standpoint, cannot be relied upon either to fix their own problems or to correctly and accurately predict and report on things in the future. This is a huge problem.
Do you think part of it is a sort of a cultural or social pressure where to sort of break from the pack? I mean, especially when you have people with maps and data and polls saying, well, there's no way Donald Trump's going to win, and he's ticked off all these groups and he lost all the debates, that to then come out and say, no, I think Donald Trump, and there were a few who did it, has a chance to win, and here's why. Do you think there's that kind of pressure?
Absolutely. And if you're someone, and a lot of people in the press, believe it or not, are group thinkers and they are in that crowd mentality, and if that's you, you're not going to be comfortable in position providing another analysis. You and I are not like that. We talked about this. The pressure you feel when you simply report as a fact what you think you see. It's not your personal opinion of what you want to have happen, but it's treated like that. Oh, well, now you're biased because you're off the page, you're off the narrative, you're different than us. I don't mind being different than other people, but I think a lot of people are uncomfortable in that position.
It's not always easy. Cheryl Atkinson, great to see you.
Thanks.
Look forward to your book. After the break, some brand new polling done for this program on the media and the election and Donald Trump. Frank Luntz is up next. There are so many failures to examine in the wake of Donald Trump's upset victory among pundits, but also among pollsters. Joining us now from Los Angeles is Frank Luntz, the veteran pollster and Fox News contributor. Frank, you have a brand new post-election day poll. I want to put up some numbers here. Found that 54% of those surveyed found the media coverage of the election biased. 46% said fair. But look at this. Fair to each candidate. 39% said the coverage was anti-Trump. 31% said the coverage was pro-Clinton. That's a total of 70%. On the other side, only 16% said pro-Trump. 14% said anti-Clinton. What's your takeaway?
So the public got it. Let's face it. All of this for months after months after months. It was about 80% why Trump was wrong. It was maybe 10% why Clinton was right, and then everything else would have been mixed in. I think the public fully understood what was happening in this election, and I think, listening to your previous guests, that they were correct, that Donald Trump running against the media was an effective strategy. It upset the reporters. I was on Trump's plane, or the media plane, the day before the election. The reporters were used to it by that point. They were used to being a focal point of Trump's criticism. But for those who didn't want Washington to control their lives, it was an effective strategy. One more thing, Howie. What I found interesting was in the exit polls, when we studied why they were so wrong in state after state after state, it's because Trump voters refused to participate. It's not that they lied. It's not that they changed their information when they were filling out the ballot. It's that they said, I don't want to do this. I don't want to help the media. I don't want to help the establishment. I'm not going to take that poll. No one knew that it was that deep and that passionate until Election Day, and this is going to continue well into the administration.
Yeah, polls often have trouble measuring passion. Hillary Clinton, we should say, did win or is winning the popular vote, but because that's not how you get elected president. You got to get to 270. Exactly. Now, you made a little news on Election Day with an interview with Yahoo. Let me play a little bit of that.
There are so many failures to examine in the wake of Donald Trump's upset victory among pundits, but also among pollsters. Joining us now from Los Angeles is Frank Luntz, the veteran pollster and Fox News contributor. Frank, you have a brand new poll
Starting tonight on this show, no one will call me a Republican again, because I'm not part of this. I'm not part of that system. I'm not part of that negativity.
Now, you go way back. You worked with Newt Gingrich in 1994 in the contract with America. What do you mean no one will call you a Republican again?
Because it's not appropriate, because I've tried over the last 2 years to tell it straight. I did this on 60 Minutes. I did it for the New York Times. I did it for Time Magazine, and for the BBC, trying to be correct, trying to be accurate, and not taking a point of view. And for you to label me, for the media to label me a Republican, is not proper. There are some people who come on, like James Carville, who is always going to take the Democratic perspective, and there's some people who come on who will always take the Republican perspective. My job is to be accurate and to be precise and to not take any side. And I've just had it with this labeling, because we know that...
Well, you've had a lot of Republican clients over the years. I think that's part of the labeling. But you also said in that interview, we just played it, that you're not part of the negativity. So the impression that I got is you were not happy with the way Donald Trump ran his campaign, and you didn't want to be associated with that either.
I was not happy with the entire tone. I was not happy with the debates because there wasn't enough substance. It was all about personality. I was not happy with the advertising.
Less so.
The Chris Wallace debate was the exception. The Chris Wallace debate actually showed people that you could have a real conversation about issues and you could understand where the candidates were coming from. And he deserves tremendous kudos. But Howard, for the most part, this campaign was the most negative of anything I've experienced in the 30 years that I've been doing it. And there has to be a way for people to unite. There has to be common ground. If you really want to get tax reform, if you really want to get an anti-poverty program, if you really want the U.S. to reestablish itself in the world order, then you're going to have to work across the aisle to get these things done.
Let me sneak in one more question. You said in an essay in Time Magazine, Frank, that you were shocked by the outcome, that there was an echo chamber in the media and political establishment, the certainty that a guy like Trump could never win. Did you fall prey to that echo chamber like a lot of people?
I absolutely thought, when I saw the exit polls, and they had +5, +6 in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio was dead even, Florida, Clinton had the lead. I was sure that Clinton was going to win. I had no doubt, based on the exit polls. And they were your exit polls. They were Fox News exit polls, and it was clear. And then when the election result happened, I was as stunned as anybody. But then you accept that, you acknowledge your mistake, you learn from it, and then you move forward.
All right.
And Howard, we've got to find a way to move forward where it is about all of us together rather than about winners and losers. And I think that's going to be a very important theme that I'm going to be pushing between now and election day.
A good closing sentiment. Frank Luntz, great to see you from Los Angeles. Still to come, the late-night comics who savaged the Donald try to come to grips with President Trump. And can journalists now be fair to the president-elect? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. The New York Times published a truly extraordinary banner headline after the election. Here it is. Democrats, students, and foreign allies face the reality of a Trump presidency. The clear implication was that many people the paper finds sympathetic remain shocked, even appalled, by the prospect of President Trump. It's virtually impossible to imagine such a Times headline after a Democratic victory. The paper's editor and publisher now saying perhaps Trump's sheer unconventionality led them to underestimate his support and promising to be fair. This is some journalists and even some media critics question how the news business so utterly botched this high-stakes election that so many expected Hillary Clinton to win.
It's hard to be a parent tonight for a lot of us. You tell your kids, don't be a bully. You tell your kids, don't be a bigot. They're afraid of, how do I explain this to my children?
Laura Ingraham, according to a report in The Hill, under consideration for White House press secretary. Joining us now to analyze the coverage of the election and its aftermath, Erin McPike, a political commentator and former reporter for Real Clear Politics. Kristen Soltis Anderson, a Washington Examiner columnist and a Republican strategist. And Julie Roginski, a Democratic strategist and Fox News contributor. Erin, the election is over, and it seems to me that there are still major elements in the media that are kind of being hostile to President-elect Trump. What explains that?
I don't know what explains it, but there's still obviously a lot of shock. You showed the New York Times headline from Thursday morning, but we continue to see headlines in the New York Times that are of resignation. I would point you to the Washington Post, where the headlines are more of intrigue and an openness to cover what is to come. But we even saw that Arthur Sulzberger Jr. put out this memo to readers on Friday saying we got it wrong, as you mentioned. They're still trying to figure it out, but they haven't quite gotten there yet. We are seeing today, I looked through the pages of the New York Times, not just the front page, and they are doing stories now on what is actually going on in the Rust Belt. Where were those stories after he won the primary?
Well,
where was the
because
mood of the country
the
story?
media consensus was the Rust Belt wasn't in play. Hillary Clinton had it locked up. Here's a story in the New York Times. It's a news story, Kristen, from when he met with President Obama at the White House. Mr. Trump, whose campaign drew support from white supremacist groups, sat in front of a bust of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So are the media risking their credibility with these kinds of news passages and headlines?
There are a lot of places, when you look at the election returns, that voted for Obama quite heavily 2 elections in a row. Places like Luzerne County in Pennsylvania that have now flipped and become Trump country. These are not places that have been rejecting President Obama all along. These are places that, for economic reasons, have changed their attitude and decided that Trump is the person who's most likely to...
Right, so why did the press not pick up on that during 18 months of campaigning?
I think, you saw in a lot of polls that you always had the white working class leaning towards Trump. What was missed was that a lot of, for instance, college-educated white voters, etc., were breaking for Donald Trump. Black voters, Latino voters, the exit polls suggest, broke for Donald Trump in much higher margins than the polls would have suggested. So I think that's actually the group that the media missed. It wasn't the white working class so much, because we knew that they were going to go for Trump. It's a lot of white college-educated professionals, African Americans and Latinos, who voted for Trump, even though the media said that would be impossible.
Julie, it seems like some of the media just can't come to grips right now with the fact that Trump won. What do you think of that? And why don't you start with your own reaction when you came out of the train station here in Washington?
I did. I came here yesterday. I walked out of Union Station. I looked at the Capitol where I used to work, and I said, I just can't believe it. And I think a lot of people, not just in the media, but Democrats like me and others, are in disbelief. I will say, and having thought about this, I think the conclusion that I came to is people like me, and I'll put the blame on myself as well as the media, live in an ivory tower. We live in Washington, or we live in New York. We aren't worried necessarily about putting our kids through college.
On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, shockwaves over the greatest media failure in modern political history. Failing to grasp, with all the talk about Hillary Clinton on the verge of victory, that the country would elect President Trump.
So we are having a conversation now that it was impossible to have 2 weeks ago. It was just improbable. You were not having a reality-based conversation trying to do this map.
It's just remarkable because, I mean, I don't think we can overstate this. Not only Democrats and the Clinton campaign, not only pollsters and the mainstream media, but Republicans did not anticipate that this night was going to be this way.
I think we're all, at least I'm coming to the conclusion today, conclusion is the wrong word, to open to the possibility Donald Trump could be the next president of the United States. Let's be honest, there's no one I know who thought this 3 hours ago.
To those who have chosen not to support me in the past, of which there were a few people, I'm reaching out to you for your guidance and your help so that we can work together and unify our great country.
Why did so many journalists underestimate the anger and frustration of Trump's voters? Why were the pundits and the pollsters so spectacularly wrong? And why are some liberal commentators blaming the press for not stopping Trump? That's not our job. Plus, Donald Trump says Twitter helped him win the election.
We can afford to do that. We're not worried so much about paying for our health care. We can do that. We're not worried so much about making our mortgage or our rent payments. We can do that. What we have forgotten, to our own detriment, is that there are people who, whenever I went on TV over the last 4 years and said, but wait, the economy's getting better, look at these metrics, there are white working class voters, and not just white working class voters, but as you pointed out, Latinos and African Americans and others, who said, maybe on paper it's getting better, but I can't pay my mortgage.
Right.
You're saying it's great that more people are that have health care insurance thanks to Obamacare, which I've consistently touted, but I'm paying more and more out of my pocket for those premiums, and people like me forgot about those people.
There's a phrase of that. It's called out of touch. And Aaron, let me play for you a question that I asked you just this past Sunday, 2 days before the election. Aaron, a number of pundits came out 2 weeks ago and said this race was over, done, Hillary was going to win, who's going to be in her cabinet, no way Trump could pull this thing off. Was that, in retrospect, reckless? And you basically said that it was, and this is when no one thought Trump was going to win. So if virtually all of the media were wrong about Hillary Clinton winning this election, what does it say? I mean, Politico had a headline that the morning of the election, Trump needs a miracle. How do we now have the pundits coming on saying, well, we're going to tell you what's going to happen in this thing that we said was not going to happen?
What do you mean? That the pundits are going to say what's going to happen in a Trump presidency?
Yeah.
We